Thank you. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Mark Couder. We were asked to pull together this panel to talk about community adaptation and how it relates to both city operations and programs, but also how to sort of connect academics, professors, students with the work around climate adaptation. One thing you'll notice on this panel is that there's nobody from the community actually here. Most of the panel is either going to be city staff or city professors or UT professors. And originally we thought about having a community member here, but I think it's also important for us to actually come together sometimes just to talk about these things. We all in some capacity talk to community members, oftentimes the same ones, sometimes different ones. But you know, it comes to a situation where the community gives us a lot of great information, a lot of great sort of lived experience, things we should really take to heart and figure out how to incorporate into our work. But we never actually get time to sit down and sort of analyze that, digest that, and figure out what to do with it. And I think that's key, is that how do we work together to better sort of capture community lived experience, to figure out how to make that usable, how to turn that into decision making, and how to sort of understand how that works. So today's discussion is going to be mostly about how can the city, which has about 12,000 employees, work with UT Austin, which I think also has about 12,000 employees, multiple departments, multiple siloed, more than 12,000.
It's like double that, yeah.
24,000 employees. So as you can imagine, these are very large institutions with silos, with departments. And then making those connections doesn't always work. So today we're going to talk about, you know, how has this discussion around town and gown and community engagement changed in the last 5 years? What's currently going on within the city, but also within UT Austin? And then what does the future look like, the next 5-10 years? And what are some opportunities we should be thinking about and working together on? So with that, I'm going to introduce myself and then let the panel introduce themselves. I'm going to start out by saying, give your name, your organization, what you do at your organization, and then there's going to be an icebreaker question. And the icebreaker question is, who would you rather meet, your ancestors or your descendants? So I'm going to start. My name is Mark Couder. I work with the Office of Sustainability at the City of Austin. We work primarily on climate and food policy, and my work primarily focuses on climate adaptation. And on the ancestor-descendant, I'd prefer to meet my descendants to make sure that I actually did a good enough job to make things better. So with that, Miriam?
Hi everyone, I'm Miriam Solis. I'm an assistant professor of community and regional planning, where my research and teaching focus on environmental justice. And I would like to meet my descendants because a lot of my work focuses on youth development. And one of the projects that you'll likely hear about today is our work with youth of color on thinking through decarbonization strategies. But yesterday, actually, at a panel run by Adam, our Planet Texas chair, one of our panelists spoke about how youth are not okay because they keep hearing the message that the world is ending, that we have a climate crisis. And so I would want to know how they're doing, but also how I might contribute to their future.
Hi everyone, I'm Daniel Arriaga. I'm the Senior Special Projects Coordinator here in the Office of the Vice President for Research, Scholarship and Creative Endeavors now. I have to make sure I add that. And among other things, I support UT city collaborations through the Interlocal agreement, and so I'll be providing a little background on how that sort of was initiated. So yeah, thank you all for having me. And ancestors or descendants, I'm gonna go with ancestors, you know, because I feel like, you know, you're talking about people feeling a little despair. Maybe if I spoke to my ancestors and learned their struggles and the things that they had to go through, I might feel a little bit better about our sometimes precarious situation that we've found ourselves in. So yeah, I'm gonna go with ancestors.
It's gonna be 2 and 2. Y'all will be the deciding ancestors, descendants. Patrick Bixler, I'm a assistant professor at the OBJ School of Public Affairs. Thanks for coming. This is really awesome. I think on the descendants, ancestors already gave away my vote. I'm going to go descendants, but I don't have a great reason other than I've been watching The Last Kingdom on Netflix lately. And it's just like axes and swords and medieval feuds, and it's just really blown my mind. So I think it'd be cool to travel back and sort of see what life was like for my ancestors.
Okay. Kevin Lanza here, assistant professor at UT Health, School of Public Health in Austin, Texas. And I actually like Mark's misspoke earlier where he mentioned city staff and city professors, because I do think a lot of us faculty here are city professors in the sense of who we work with, and I hope that becomes a position one day in terms of memorialized. And so I work on climate equity. I look at how the environment impacts physical activity specifically, and how we can promote safe physical activity in warm weather climates. And ancestors or descendants? I'll go with ancestors. I think if I knew what our descendants, the kind of the environment they were in, then it may affect my energy levels as to how I work on what I'm doing. So I think getting that experience from my ancestors and understanding their perspective could continue that drive and energy. So yeah, ancestors.
Awesome. Hi. Okay. Hi, I'm Phoebe Rometto. I work with the City of Austin Office of Sustainability with Mark, and I have a dual role. So I work on our climate planning process with the Austin Climate Equity Plan and its implementation, really focused on the equity strategy in that and then the buildings portion. I also help implement our regional air quality plan, which is more focused on municipal actions, so what the City of Austin does to reduce its air quality impact. And I would meet my ancestors, specifically I think my indigenous ancestors. For those of us who have been colonized communities, I think a lot of that history has been erased, so I'd like to just learn what I don't have access to.
Great. Thank you. So today we're going to sort of go through 3 themes. The first theme is what has sort of community engagement and collaboration between town and gown been like for the past 5 years, what's currently going on, and then lastly, what's going to be like in the next 5 years. So actually, I want to start with you, Miriam. You know, when I think of, you know, collaborations between cities and universities, it mostly comes down to like consultants. How can a professor write a report, do the work, and then they hand it over to us and we do something with it? Is that still the case, or has that changed in the last 5 years? Like, how has that relationship changed?
Yeah, so I think it's a very important contextual question, and I'm an urban planning professor, so context is everything. And I think that I'll touch on a few different things. One is that with regard to UT as an institution, my institutional memory is actually pretty short, but we have an incredible group of leadership here who would be able to tell probably a very complicated and exciting story of how UT is now better positioned to engage in applied research. That is a very, very deliberate, it's an explicit strategy that many universities don't take up. And we actually have a lot of examples already of universities that have been doing this for a long time. In the urban planning field, sometimes we refer to these very engaged strategies as an anchor institution strategy. What kinds of jobs are created, how involved is the university faculty and the community, how are their research supporting local positive social change. And what I'll say is that I've been very, very fortunate to be a part of Planet Texas. And this is a multidisciplinary research initiative. I hope that you've all learned about it, certainly through Resilience Week or are already involved. If not, there's a lot of opportunity to become involved, so certainly reach out to us. But as part of that network and through my community and regional planning role, I've been involved in 4 different projects where the City of Austin is, in very technical speak, considered a client, but I do think that we push back against that framing in the sense that it's a relationship. And it's a long-term relationship where we have mutual objectives about generating very important insights on what might contribute to positive local change. Within Planet Texas, there's a reason it's 2050, right? We want to see change. We want to see that the research that we're fortunate to be a part of are meaningfully contributing. And one of the statistics that my collaborator, Carmen Valdez, often cites, and she's in the social welfare field, public health, is that in her field, research doesn't translate into action for an average of 11 years. And when we think about the climate crisis, that's far too long. Because as we know, people are literally already dying, and this isn't something that's happening in faraway places, but it's happening in our own communities. We certainly saw the consequences of that during the winter storm here in Austin. So there's an urgency and there's a shared goal of having an incredible impact. One of the things that I think is happening across disciplines is a commitment to developing, to improving methodologies that allow us to better understand and work with community, right? So there's a huge institutional intervention happening on UT's part, massive. But there's also a change across disciplines that value community-based participatory research methods. This is a series of methods that you will find in education, in social welfare, in public health, in urban planning, where scholars have recognized the limitations of traditional research methods with regard to particular issues. And we take the idea of co-creating research very seriously. In my own experience, I was trained in this method, right? So it's not just, I woke up one day and decided to do this kind of research, but there's actually a whole educational trajectory and research path involved in improving these kinds of methods that are oftentimes mostly actually qualitative, right? An example of that is photo voice. And actually, that's one project that I've been working with the City of Austin with on. We just did a photo voice project with Austin Civil and Conservation Corps participants. And I want to be able to share the findings, but we haven't issued our report yet. But I think we have some very, very important discussions coming up as a result of the collaborative work that we engaged in.
You mentioned photo voice. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is?
Sure. So photo voice is a very elaborate methodology. I think sometimes it's something that can certainly be applied or undertaken by practitioners, by organizations, but researchers also use it to co-create research. So in this particular case, we, as part of a larger green job study, we wanted to learn what are some of the challenges or limitations of existing green jobs investments that the City of Austin is making. So we partnered with the Parks Department to learn what Austin Civil and Conservation Corps members, again, this is a green jobs training program, are learning, and what are some things that need to change when we apply kind of an equity normative framework to what we'd like to see happen. So it's community-based participatory research is always an iterative process. So we worked with a workforce development organization, the City of Austin, Michael Oden, who's the principal investigator for this project, to finalize a set of questions. These were multiple discussions just to get at the questions. And then we ran several workshops with ACCC participants to discuss the method, what it can do, and they used their cell phones to take photographs in response to the questions, which therefore allowed us to synthesize some broader insights on those particular driving questions.
Awesome. So it's really about connecting data to stories and sort of making it sort of come alive in a way.
Yeah, and I would say that it as part of a larger community of inductive researchers, right? It's not just in response to the data. We're actually identifying data points that are not in the data, right? That's how data sets come to be, is through these qualitative interventions on what's missing. And I think that that's a very important part of the work that we're doing.
You mentioned that you're working with people at the City of Austin with this, and I know that if you want to reach out to us, we're always there. But I also know that there's a lot of professors, we have a lot of city staff. So I'm going to ask the next question to Daniel. You mentioned the interlocal agreement. Why do we need an interlocal agreement?
Yeah, so just to give you all a little bit of the historical context, it's been several years now since Charles Perma, with the Innovation Office, who's sitting here with us today, came to our office and really was asking us what existing city UT projects are on the books, and we really didn't know. So we went to our sponsor projects office, and in doing some sleuthing, we found that a couple things were readily apparent. One, we didn't know, it was very difficult to amass this list because we're both very decentralized organizations. We didn't really have a clear picture of which city departments were collaborating with UT. So in that process, we realized, okay, well, we need a better understanding of where we're collaborating already. And then we also realized that it was actually really hard for city projects to actually fund because they were being processed as business contracts as opposed to research projects. And when that's the case, it triggers a lot of regulations and hurdles that make it a little more difficult to get those projects initiated. So if a project is more than $150,000, for example, under a business contract, that has to go to council for approval. So the idea came about, and our legal teams got together, and they're like, let's build this master interlocal agreement. Let's cut through some of that red tape and make it a little easier. So now that they are classified as research, we're seeing, I think, the general sense on both camps is that this is more a copacetic relationship now. They're not having to deal as much with sort of the legal teams, but deal with, scope of work and timelines. And so it's been a really interesting experience. I think it's been over a year and a half. We've queried about 50 different ILA pre-proposal ideas. Within that, we've been able to match roughly half of those, match UT researchers to city departments, and then we have about a dozen contracts that are on the books. So that's really, I think, a testament to how successful it's been, and there's several in the works, so yeah, we're really excited.
Yeah, I mean, it really shows that there's a lot of interest and a lot of need between what you guys can provide and what your goals are and what our goals are and what we need to do. Oftentimes when we talk about data, we always try to tie it back to decision making, like what decision are we trying to make and what data do we need, and then we're sort of like in the lost. And luckily, you guys are here to sort of help us out. So I appreciate your work. But I also think there's some really good examples at UT, and I want to hand it off to Patrick because I know, Patrick, you've worked with the city for some years now, and between the heat work, the A2SI, and all that, can you sort of give us an overview of what has gone well?
Yeah, that was not the question you asked me to prepare for, Mark.
But the follow-up question is, what didn't go well?
Yeah.
And to let people know, the initial question was, what's the opposite of the ivory tower?
Yeah.
But since you brought that up.
Before I'm gonna work my way into this because I want to share this story that just happened like 30 minutes ago. So I was trying to leave my office and fix my hair and put my shirt on. And the phone rings, and I don't normally answer my phone, but I felt like I should answer my office phone. Usually I do answer my office phone. And it was, so let me back up 1 second. So the Planet Texas 2050 flagship project that we're working on has two initial case sites, one in Southeast Texas, Beaumont, Port Arthur, and then Austin. This was actually somebody from Port Arthur calling. John Beard, he's the CEO of Port Arthur Community Action Network, and we happen to be doing a survey right now trying to understand how different stakeholders are perceiving flooding risks and threats and drivers and impacts, as well as studying the networks. So how are these different organizations, city, community, county agencies, community organizations, how do they work together? So we do some network analysis. And he called me, because his link was broken to the survey, so it was a big fail on my part. But he proceeded to tell me how important he thought this work was. He proceeded to tell me the story of his neighbor, Dorothy, whose house was flooded in 2008. She couldn't figure out how to do the paperwork. When she finally figured out the paperwork, they said they didn't have any money. Then Harvey hit, her house flooded again. All of a sudden, the paperwork became a one-page thing, and she was able to file and get a little bit of money. But he just kind of sort of went on and on about the barriers that people of color in Port Arthur are facing in dealing with building community resilience and sort of addressing the flooding issues. And it was sort of like, here's what we need. And I was like, that's what we're trying to work on. We're trying to develop models and maps and hear from residents and understand perceptions, understand how folks work together to be able to provide people like John the information they need to go out to the cities and advocate, to hold county, fed, state officials accountable. And that sort of kind of leads me to, when I think about the work we do with the city, there's been some great successes. For example, Mark was a co-author on some research that got published in the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction. It just came out a couple of months ago. And so over the years, right, these things take a lot of time. They take relationship building, they take trust building. It has sort of been a 4 to 5 year process to figure out how we could work together in a way that could lead to research that includes academics and non-academics. But I think even sort of through that lens, there's still this gap between taking what we did and how we co-produce this knowledge together, and then really turning that into policy, turning that into practice, turning that into investments in communities. One of the things that we have recently done, a couple of weeks ago over spring break, it was a busy spring break, we submitted a proposal to NASA. Like, of all places, I never in my life thought I'd be presenting or proposing to NASA. But they did this call around integrating satellite observations to advance environmental justice. So Mark was a co-PI, Carmen Lanes Polito, the executive director of GAVA, was the PI. And so we're sort of working together to develop these teams of community members, community organizations, city representatives, faculty, to think about how we can write proposals, write paper, do research, all with the intention that that work is leading to problem-oriented knowledge, action-oriented knowledge. How do we take that information and apply it into practice? And I think that sort of the NASA proposal then ties back to my story about John, because that whole proposal was about building an integrated kind of data system that includes community voices, that includes quantitative data, that includes qualitative data, in addition to the satellite data, as ways to develop tools to hold folks accountable and to allow these community groups to do better advocacy. So I think there's a lot of work that's happening, and it's been really fun. I think it's so rewarding, but it also is really hard work in the sense that it doesn't happen naturally. There's cultural differences between the ways that academics sort of think in our hour-to-hour, day-to-day sort of life, the way city officials, leaders think, the way community organizations think. There's bandwidth issues, for sort of everyone, but particularly how do you address what it takes for typically a small-staffed community organization to be able to contribute the input that you sort of want from them, but that's a real barrier and issue. Yeah,
I think I'm the moderator, right? Because you're asking a lot of questions here. But since
we've got it took a few years, but we've got a good relationship.
So before I go to Kevin, I've been hearing a couple of themes here between you, Miriam, and you, Patrick. Miriam, you said urgency, right? There needs to be things that happen now because people are dying. And you mentioned that there's people who are impacted by flooding and by all these events. But at the same time, it takes time to build relationships, to build trust. And there seems to be this constant tension, like people want stuff now, but if we do it too fast, then there's this conception or this idea that we're not being equitable because we're not stopping to listen to hear people. How do I, as a city employee, sort of figure that out? Like, how do you guys sort of grapple with that in your work?
You can answer that.
Yeah, one of the things that I think a lot about in my work when it comes to building relationships is that, so I don't exist in my position in a vacuum, right? That there's actually a lot of experience and relationships that I bring into this position. And I think about all the amazing researchers across campus, across departments that bring that experience with them. And I think that I worked for 3 city governments, right? And I think that really allows for me to, I really appreciate how Patrick put it, to have a sense of how city staff operate and trying to, and this has been hard, right? I'm a junior faculty member, and so there are particular challenges that come with that, but being clear around what expectations might be, around clear objectives. So I think that, and I think that actually Mark and Phoebe, there are folks at the city developing their own culture around working with the university. And so I think that you're becoming leaders in the idea of this research practice partnership, and you'll be able to we can locally define what that starts looking like culturally, right? But similarly, I'll stop there. I was gonna, I can bring this up if time allows, but that's what I'll say, yeah.
I would just add, Mark, and I know this is something that you deal with, like when we work with community groups, we ask a lot of them. I guess this is kind of back to that bandwidth question, but hey, can you help us interview some residents? Can you help us get some survey data? Can you help us do this? Can you help us do that? And at some point, you've got to figure out what it is that we're giving back to them. What are we doing to solve issues that are of importance to them? And right, that takes time. So you sort of have this time to build the relationship, and then you have this time to work together. But at some point, it's like, hey, you guys have taken a lot. Like how do we actually start to give back? And I don't know. I mean, part of that was like sort of with the NASA proposal, about half of the budget we allocated to GAVA. It still was a pretty small percentage. But there are ways to start building in those mechanisms. Part of what we do with our Austin Indicators Community Survey is we mostly, I guess, or all of it, I guess, comes, like, so we sort of fund this oversample in zip codes that GAVA works. So we're oversampling residents in these certain zip codes so that GAVA can have that information to understand the issues, understand the perceptions. Not only that, but we've been working with them, in part, a graduate student out here, Jess, for the last 3 years has kind of worked with them in thinking about how do we design a population level evaluation framework. Hey, is GAVA making a difference in these communities that they work? And can we collect kind of random sample survey data to understand if certain metrics are changing over time? So we sort of think we're trying to be creative about ways that we add value to their work and give back to them. But I think that's a real barrier, that sort of like, hey, when's it going to be time? When do we see the change, right? I mean, I think that's sort of a question that's always hard for, I think, you and me when we're working with community groups.
Yeah, and that's a great point. If I may just add, when we established the ILA, a big concern that we got and pushback we got from the city is they did not want UT to just be like a bull in a china shop and like driving the bus and driving the agenda. They really wanted to make sure that it was a partnership and that it was mutually beneficial. So we actually, when we structured the ILA form, we actually put in there that everybody who submits a form has to indicate which of the strategic directions, 2030 goals this applies to. So that's a really good point, is, we wanted to be a partnership, we wanted to be a door to the community and not just have UT, driving the bus, and making sure that, community partners are held to a high regard,
Yeah, absolutely. We've all heard that term of that we collaborate at the speed of trust. I mean, we've all heard that, but that speed is not constant, right? It actually increases as you continue to work together. So the trick is, though, for the city, and I think Patrick mentioned this, is that we have to follow up, right? If we talk to the community, we say we're going to do something, we have to do it. And if we don't, then we lose trust and we're back to zero. But the dream, I would say, is that we do the project, we talk, we do another project, and we just start to build on those projects over time. And I think that's what we sort of have to focus on going forward. But speaking of going forward, I'm going to talk to Kevin. Kevin, you're fairly new to UT.
I'm actually not even at UT.
Yeah,
I'm at
that's right.
UT Health, which
Yes.
is in the University of Texas system, and we're about 200 meters from UT, renting a UT building. So it's not fair.
Someday you'll come over this side. Looking forward the next 5 years, like, how do you see this changing, and how do you see your work with community, with HEAT, and that collaboration? Is it going to change over the next 5 years, or how do you see that happening?
I think it will. Getting out my crystal ball, I think this type of community work is probably the most challenging type of work, because it is time intensive. It isn't just a quantitative method that you plug in some numbers and get some output through some type of algorithm or code. I think it's affecting locally to drive global change, but at the same time it's leaning into those already conceived evidence-based global solutions. And so understanding that in heat health research and just heat health in general, it's knowing that there have been successes across the world, and then those successes should be understood to see if they can be made possible in local settings. And so that's through, one of my favorite mantras is from the South African civil rights movement, or civil disability rights movement, which is nothing about us without us is for us. In the sense that if you don't work alongside those who you're trying to work with, then you're truly not going to have an effective solution. And so one has to think widely in terms of tapping into their global network of successful strategies, and then understanding alongside community members how those strategies could potentially affect change in your community. And so that's a lot to digest, right? And I wish there was some type of depository that just pooled all of these effective strategies across the world for these different sectors, right? That we could just click on. And so that's an idea. Another idea which I've heard of is aligning metrics. And so it's being selfish in the best of ways. I say this all too often. And so that is making sure that your work currency and your personal value currency is being hit in any type of collaborations you work in. And so, for example, I'm a researcher, so I know in my position for work at least, I will need to publish manuscripts and I will need to be successful with extramural funding. And so if I can bring those and hit those with a collaboration, then that gives extra incentive and emphasis to make that collaboration successful. Similarly, I suspect Phoebe, Mark have different metrics than I do, and at times they do overlap, right? But we need to see where in the pipeline of our collaboration we best fit. And I think that has to deal with a lot of transparency, which gets to my next point, which is going slow to go fast. Another term we've probably heard, which is we have all this excitement, we want to put in new sidewalks to promote physical activity, but then what is that sidewalk material doing to our built environment and our health, right? Is it the right material? Is it good for stormwater? How long does it last? Is that actually potentially, consequentially, promoting potential car use still because of just allowing roads to still be first and foremost, right? So go to Europe, check that out, global solution. And so specifically Northern Europe. And so I think it's understanding how to plan intentionally to reach one's far-reaching large vision and outcome as technology ages and shifts and evolves so quickly, right? So is a subway really the right thing to build? Or is there something that goes beyond that? Are electric cars really reducing traffic congestion? The answer is no, right? That's still a single car passenger vehicle going on the road. And so another idea is what's possible in your local setting. So what kind of policy or intervention can you actually test and find if it's successful? Do we have as partners the wherewithal to create a pilot test of a policy? So there's a joint use agreement of City of Austin parks with the Austin Independent School District where park spaces at schools, in certain schools, are open to the community outside of school hours. That's a wonderful equity component because this is just fertile play space that naturally, normally, and traditionally, and wrongly, isn't open to the community in most settings. But when you have this joint use agreement, it allows it 24-hour access just for different populations. And so do we have the ability to test that in other cities? Like, what's the red tape there? Who needs to be in the room? And so I think it's just going slow, assessing based on these solutions that have been possible elsewhere and advancing those solutions, right? And that's what I got.
That's covered a lot of ground in a couple of minutes. I appreciate that. But speaking about a lot of ground, I'm going to hand it off to Phoebe. Phoebe, I know you co-led the Climate Equity Plan, which was a really significant piece of work within the city, you know, working with 150 community members through a long and really sort of specific equity lens process. But now that the plan has been adopted by council, we're sort of in the implementation piece. Can you tell us a little bit about the plan and how do you see implementation happening over the next 5 years? Or what's some opportunities, to put it that way?
Yeah. So the plan got approved in September of last year. It was a 2-year-long process, a lot of work put into it from not just city staff, but community members and other industry professionals. UT was a huge participant in that process. So right now we're grappling with a lot of different things. We had a very robust community engagement process, and it was in some ways very direct what the role of community was at that particular time and what our role was. It was to gather community feedback and then do our best to transform that into strategies and transform that into goals. The plan is an aggressive plan to reach net zero by 2040, and there are 5 sections from transportation to buildings, and then 2 more innovative sections that were focused on natural systems and how those can help sequester carbon. And then looking beyond, our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions to Scope 3, which is really the emissions associated with everything that we purchase and consume, and thinking about buildings, not just the energy that they use, but also the materials that are used to construct that, right? So to the sidewalk example, a lot of concrete is responsible for emissions globally. So how do we start tackling those issues? And so there are multiple challenges, I would say. From a research standpoint, the plan was innovative. We really tried to find what other cities, not just in the U.S., but globally, were putting into their climate plans. And so in some ways, there's that burden of being an innovator. We don't have a whole lot of examples, right? Sometimes cities reach out to us and they're like, how did you develop the embodied carbon goal? And it's like, oh, well, we just saw that Vancouver also had that, similar goal. And so we were trying to align with other industry actually work, right? And so we've done a lot of work with organizations that are doing some deep research in this to make sure that we're aligned with what the industry standards are and that we're not just like making up goals, but at the same time, achieving a baseline and actually measuring that progress is difficult. Refrigerant strategies, again, a very powerful greenhouse gas that hasn't been previously addressed by a lot of our climate planning in the past. So there's that end of things, carbon sequestration. How do you make that locally beneficial? And then how do you integrate equity into all of these things? If we're talking about embodied carbon and why it matters, oftentimes people are like, well, that's going to be a lot of our emissions. But that also has health impacts, right? The materials that we put into buildings have health impacts at their manufacturing stage, and then, of course, through off-gassing, like inside a building. There's a lot of work with supply chain justice, and I think that tying that in with like labor standards, and so thinking like much more holistically. It's not just about reducing emissions, but there's so much equity tied across the supply chain and across all of these actions. Now back to the community. It's like, how do you continue implementation and make sure that there's not a perception of building relationships during a planning stage, then saying, okay, well now we are going to implement this plan. Thank you very much for your time. We'll see you in 5 years when we're trying to revise it. And that is what cities, not just Austin, I'm not calling out my own employer here, but that is oftentimes what cities have done. That is a lot of how traditional engagement has been done, surveying, doing things that are much more surface level. And so right now we have an ambassadors program. We had one for our planning process, and we're trying to make that an ongoing program, and we're trying to redesign that to be actionable in implementation. And so the way that looks, or some of, we're still figuring that out, but one of the biggest kind of themes that we figured out is like, how do we have equitable relationship building where it's mutually beneficial, right? And so if we're talking about grants, right, and applying for grants, oftentimes, UT will apply for a grant and then they're like, hey, we want city involvement to make sure that this is oriented towards policy action. And then there's also that like thing where it's like, oh, and we also need community engagement as part of it. And we as a city need to have a breadth of community partnerships that are bringing that, right? Like the city of Austin is a big city. There's a lot of organizations that I think we know about, but I think there's a lot of organizations that are doing work at a smaller scale or at a neighborhood level, and they're doing amazing work and we don't know about them and they don't know about us. And so the whole point of this is to try to bridge that connection. And so I'll leave it there. I didn't ramble too long. But.
That was great. Thank you. Part of the discussion today, though, is trying to identify research opportunities. Can you just walk us quickly through the 5 pieces of the climate equity plan, and just hopefully that will start to get people thinking about questions, but also research ideas.
Sure. So I mentioned natural systems, and then we have 5 sections. Natural systems is one of them. We have transportation and land use, which is the intersection of transportation with housing. Transportation electrification, which is, not just electrifying personal vehicles, but also electrifying fleets, and hopefully over time as more models come out, heavy duty vehicles and all of those other types of, transportation mechanisms, buses, et cetera. We have a sustainable building section that I mentioned is not just focused on operational carbon, but also embodied carbon, refrigerants, water reduction. And then we have a food and product consumption section. I think a huge part of that is the institutional purchasing piece and the healthy, equitable, accessible, planet-friendly food piece. And so it's there's strategies all around that. I think the biggest opportunities that we see with research is with some of our overarching strategies. There's 4 of them. One of them is on green jobs and just advancing equitable green jobs. A lot of the work that Medium has been doing, and an important part of that is like, how do we provide skills that are all across the labor spectrum, so to speak, not just just, training for skills-based work like installing solar panels, but also like providing a system that allows for people of color to have entrepreneurship skills to start their own businesses that are advancing this work, right? So everything. We have a goal focused on carbon dioxide removal and local carbon sequestration projects and carbon offsets, which is not my area of expertise at all, and I don't think any of our areas. And so that's a huge research opportunity simply because there's a lot of, I think that, we're missing from that perspective. It's a big research project, and we would, love input and expertise on that. The institutional purchasing, again, there's the research aspect, but I think as like faculty and staff, there's also an opportunity to advocate for what is being done at a large institution like UT. We certainly think about that in the city and what the city can be doing to lead on that. But as a very, direct example of that, our office has done work with Austin ISD, our local school district, to implement a good food purchasing program. And so I used to teach at Austin ISD 10 years ago, and I can tell you that the food and the way that, a cafeteria looked back then to how it looks now, everything's, compostable, there's a lot of reusable dishes, there's bulk milk purchase, there's plant-based food, and it's been completely transformed. So how do you replicate that at an institution like this? So that's another one. Designing for complete communities. Y'all are on a very walkable college campus, but if you drive, just a little bit or even walk a little bit outside of the central core of Austin, it's not such a walkable and complete community, particularly for our communities in the east side, right? You have less access to social services and resources, so how do you advance that work? And so I've gone on a lot, but I think I've provided maybe some direct examples. Happy to provide more and expand as needed.
Anybody here working on any of those topics? I saw a maybe. Anybody have any questions? I'm going to call on all of you to ask a question. I'm going to ask the first one, and then I'm going to look at you two to think of a good question, okay? My first one is it's a zinger. When I go to conferences, I always listen to other people talk about how great their projects were and how they did everything right. I never hear a conference where people are like, here are all the mistakes we made. What was that? Yeah. So who am I going to start with? Like, who wants to talk about, like, what's a mistake you made, and then how did you overcome it? Or maybe you didn't.
I plead the fifth. Yeah.
All right.
Well, I'm Cuban and I don't know Spanish, so that's my issue there, and I haven't overcome that. I'm trying to learn Italian now because my partner, but I guess one thing is science is inherently imperfect, and so there are always going to be limitations. For those who have read those research manuscripts, you always see the limitations section, but the only and that's why when you see like the politicization of like something like a COVID-19 pandemic and how there are certain parties that are saying, oh, well, look at the science. They're changing their policies like every other day. Well, that's because it's imperfect, and they're doing the best they can with the materials they have and the minds they have, right? And so I think it's, I'd always be interested in people just being more transparent, right? And so there are some journals now, research peer-reviewed journals, that are publishing null findings in the sense that insignificant findings, and they're more so presenting the methods and the limitations of those projects so others can learn from those projects to expand and advance those projects. The other thing is, I think it starts at also the individual level. So if you see anyone that's ever been successful, it's because they've had many failures, and they've been able to learn from and move from those failures. And so if you ever had a CV, similar to how you want to see all the limitations of something, if you ever had a CV of all the negative aspects, my negative CV is much better than my current CV, or better being longer. And so I just, I think hold yourself to a high standard and realize success begets success, and there's a lot of inertia behind that. And so, yeah, the people that have made it the farthest in whatever metric that is simply because oftentimes there's different starting points. That's the equity piece. There's also a lot of it is good mentoring, and I don't think one should underestimate that in terms of the people around you and the people that entrust in you. And as they rise, they also lift. And so I think that's something to think about. So find those right people that are trusting in your ideas.
Great, thank you.
I'll just add, I mean, and this is not your question at all, but I'm going to go with it. I'll just add that, I mean, I think that the mentoring, but it's really your collaborators, right? And the partners and the partnerships you build to do the research, which is also sort of that, is it the limit? It's the limitation. I kind of forgot your question now, which I think was intentional. But part of what, like, how do you continue to harp on the same theme, value and appreciate your research collaborators? This is kind of what Phoebe said. Hey, we go and we do these surveys, and then we say, see you in 5 years. How do you maintain relationships around your results, the impacts, what do you do now with folks who are part of the research process? I think one thing that my wife overbuys Christmas cards every year. Crazy. And so one thing, I think, Mark, you got a Christmas card this year, right? Phoebe, you didn't.
Was it nice?
So one thing that, like, right, how do you just show a small token of appreciation for all of those community partners, research partners, collaborators, who are so important to sort of my individual success? I would be nowhere without collaborators, you know, some in this room, some in the city, across campus, et cetera. And so I think, like, is that, like, what did we do wrong? Well, I think we need to I need to better maintain the appreciation that I feel for all the great partners I work with, and you know, make sure folks understand that's really valuable. Great. Sorry, Phoebe, we still have a big stack.
If you start now, you can get next year's, right?
Yeah.
No, it's great. We have
I'll come back with the mistakes. Okay. Jessica.
I had a question about if there's been any interest in kind of a menu of community partners and what kind of work they relate to or work in, as well as a menu of different engagement styles like photo voice, focus groups. If there's been any interest or connection with you all on, like, hey, I'm looking for a community partner in transportation or in the food systems, and then also what kind of, how can I work with the community partner? If you've seen any lists pre-created for UT professors.
Yeah, on the former, I would definitely say absolutely. That's funny you should ask, because it's something we actively think about in the VPR's office. I would say, you hear community engaged research impact being circulated a lot. It's in President Hartzell's strategic plan, right? So it's definitely something that we're thinking about at central level. Is like, could we create like a portal or a platform that you could go to and search for potential community partners or potential organizations? It's absolutely something we're definitely considering for UT, because I think it's something that we need to do to step up our game and get to that next level. I don't know if you want to answer the later part,
Yeah, well, with regard to method, I think that I keep thinking about the role that ethnic studies had in my own trajectory. I did ethnic studies as an undergraduate, and the history of race and racism in the United States, and the legacy of American studies and ethnic studies departments. And as part of that, their methodology has been a huge kind of research focus in that field. And so I think that there are methods that we need to think about bringing in to this work that we're overlooking. It's the historical archives, it's oral histories, it's so there are there are so many different methods, and different disciplines focus on different methods, use different methods, and there are power dynamics among methods, right? And so I think that we need to continue to think about that as we move forward.
So Joanna, and then we'll go back.
So I'm Johanna Arendt, and I work with Travis County. I'm actually new in my job as Community Resiliency Project Manager. Before that, I was doing community outreach for Balcones Paleos Preserve, so I have a natural resources and community engagement background. And it's a new program at, thanks. It's a new program at the county. Is this on?
I don't think so.
Hello? It's on now. It's on now?
Yes.
Okay. And I've been thinking about the very same thing. Like, I know, like, just like Phoebe was saying, there are so many groups that may not know about us, we don't know about them. How do we almost crowdsource a database and be able to search it? And that would be super helpful for us. And as a part of that also is kind of a mapping of who's working on what areas and what areas need more help. And how do you measure that? And how do you, do an analysis of that? And so that was one of the things I was kind of hoping to talk to folks here today about, because I'm sure there's ways to do that I'm not aware of, but that's my follow-up there.
So, I think, Patrick, you did a whole mapping of community members, right? Community groups?
Of community groups. Yeah, I mean, yes, let's talk. And you also sent me an email a couple weeks ago, so let's talk. You know what, I mean, yes, so I think, so much of our work is thinking about the population ecologies of community organizations. Where do they work? How do they work? How do they work together? And we've got a variety of projects, nothing that is really exactly what we're talking about here. Something we're doing currently is working with the Texas Water Foundation to try to map all relevant water-related organizations, public, private, nonprofit, across the state of Texas. It's crazy. We've got like a list of 20,000 entities right now, but we're sort of spatially mapping them, trying to create a interface for decision makers. You can sort of type in your zip code or your county, and sort of these relevant organizations pop up. So I think I think it's a great idea. I think there are ways that we've got a data scientist on our team that builds these like R shiny applications, and it just the data science is there. If you figure out where to get the information, and then always keeping that up to date is a real challenge.
Management.
But I think that yes, I couldn't agree more. I think this type of interface is really fascinating, needed. I think it would be really helpful. And even kind of taking that one step further, how do we, right? This is part of what this panel is about. How do we create some type of interface that really has the capacity to link community groups to faculty, to city, county agencies? I think sort of that matching process, kind of figuring out how to do that in a way that's user-friendly could be really powerful.
Yeah, if I may add to that, the matchmaking piece is a big component of it. I think it's taking inventory, like, what's available, and what are those interests, and where do people, like, where do they see themselves applying their craft? What are their skill sets? So I can mention two anecdotes related to this. So one was, we had created through the American Public Health Association's physical activity section, which is like maybe a few of 400, 500 members, this physical activity investigator registry, or PAIR. And the idea was to share someone's contact information, their name, their institution, nationwide, along with their skill sets and what they're open to. And then it was a platform for people to connect with one another. Then you have, that's the good in theory, then tough in practice piece, which is we've only communicated it outwards maybe a couple times. It's only APHA specific. There's about 40 members on it who have gone back and forth amongst each other, but so then it's relatively small scale. So a larger scale piece, which is real and happening and current, is the Texas Children in Nature Network is one of, they have these different regional collaboratives across Texas. And this is all part of a smaller piece of a larger umbrella of the Children in Nature Network, which is international. And so in Texas, we have these 8 regional collaboratives, and I'm a tri-chair on the Austin Collaborative, which we have 200 individuals and or organizations on our listserv. But then you realize how many of those folks are actually actively engaging and participating in our monthly calls, and that gets dwindled down quickly to about 20. And so the main thing is refreshing who's on it. So I mentioned those 200 names, but realistically, there are names that those organizations don't even exist anymore, or that person's not at that organization anymore. So, and then the last piece is I wanted to peddle the PAIR Physical Activity Investigator Registry outward. And then there were some liabilities as what if it got into the wrong hands in terms of people's contact information, and then they start getting spammed and whatnot. So I think it's a work in progress.
Let me just say too, because be neglectful of me if I didn't mention this, and I just remembered, I'm sorry, Jonathan. So Jonathan created a whole network map, Jonathan Lowell, who's our community coordinator. I don't have the technical network coordinator.
I forget the full time.
So there's a network diagram of all the organizations' Planet Texas 2050 faculty from over several years have engaged, and this is a very long list of organizations. So there's already, if you're interested in working with more organizations or new ones, there's a good chance that we've engaged them somehow.
The updating piece is struggle is real there. It's hard to,
Yeah, it's always going to be a maintenance thing. It's always going to be that, there's no real substitution for having a person behind the screen, right? So you're going to have people that can man this and continue to foster those relationships. Charles and I have done this in sort of a grassroots way, but how can we scale that up, right? Like if we want to continue to do, grow these partnerships, how do you scale it up? And having actual people to do that is key, right? There's no magical database.
There was a question in the back of the room.
Yeah, I'm Adam Rabinowitz. I'm the current faculty chair of PT 2050. And I was the moderator for yesterday's panel, which Miriam was talking about. I don't think this is, there it is. Gotta speak right into it. And it was interesting when we were setting out to have a series of resilience roundtables that were focused on the climate equity plan. It was hard for me to figure out where the work that I do with Planet Texas fits in. I'm an archaeologist, and I am involved with the part of Planet Texas that looks back rather than at the present or forward. And where we found the hook was in one of the values that's expressed in the equity plan, and that is cultural preservation. And that's it's a value, and it's in the equity, the toolkit that is encompassed within the equity plan, but it's not one of those 5 areas of things that people can be doing. And I was wondering, since Phoebe Romero is here and I have the chance to actually ask one of the authors, if you could comment on where there might be opportunities for collaboration or research focused around those issues of cultural preservation and memory.
Sure. Yes, no, thank you for bringing that up, because I feel like as soon as I was done talking, I was like, oh, I didn't talk about the equity metrics and things like that. But so what he's referring to is the kind of 7 themes, we called them, of our equity tool. We had health, accessibility, affordability, accountability, cultural preservation, just transition, community capacity. I was like, as soon as I started the list, I was like, should have done that. So cultural preservation specifically, as it applies to the plan, is acknowledging the fact that Austin is a place that has not honored and preserved a lot of its history and a lot of its culture. And so for just to go back very far, obviously we're in a place that is stolen indigenous land, right? And so there's that aspect of things. From a city perspective and how the city has impacted the community that's around us. There was a master plan in 1928 that forcibly relocated Black communities to the east side of Austin. There was industrial activity there not too long after, about 30 years later, power plant, in single family neighborhoods, right? And so there's been a lot of environmental justice history locally to close down those industrial facilities in those neighborhoods, and we have a problem now with gentrification and displacement. And so when we're talking about cultural preservation, we're saying yes, it's great to maintain buildings and structures. Because deconstruction and adaptive reuse is a more carbon-friendly way to do things, sure. But it's also very important for communities of color. And in East Austin, there's also a rich history of Mexican-American culture. It's important to maintain, the history of all the places that are there. And so a lot of that is about maintaining the communities who have been there historically and their generations in place. And that is also very difficult because we also have an affordability crisis in the city, and we don't have enough housing, right? And people can't afford to buy homes. I mean, people can't afford to rent homes or rent apartments in the central city, and so we have a lot of sprawl happening. And so it's looking at all of these things holistically. It's a lot of complicated pieces, and I think that is why we need community voices, because I can come with my education on density, and I can come with my education on like what the greenest building is, but if I miss the perspective of a family who is experiencing issues with not being able to like make their property tax payments, right, and not being worried about like with the pandemic, of course, and being worried about blackouts, right, because we know that that's an issue that occurred with the winter storm, then we're making, we have a blind spot. And so that's the importance of making sure that we have various voices at the table. I hope that in some way answered your question. I think we're really talking about connecting with community organizations, connecting the arts and climate, I think is really important. And so that's some of the way that we've looked at it.
There's a question in the back.
Hello, my name is Damien. I was wondering if y'all had any visions towards like the future of housing, like any future goals towards housing, because I think housing is a big problem itself, whether it has to do with like the infrastructure of our housing, our sewage, or like the sewage, stuff like that, electrical. And I was just wondering if y'all had any like vision, any goals towards the future of housing.
Anyone?
That's a $1 trillion question. I think cities across the U.S. are hurting around that. A lot of people are moving back towards city centers, right? There was the white flight of the 50s. Now it's, I want to be near live, work, play environments, and they're not equitably distributed in terms of who can resource-wise get to it. I think it's rent stabilization, densification. Right now, it's cutting those larger parcels in half or in thirds or in fourths. I think it's building up rather than building out because of just the ecological impacts of that and the ability to share resources if you have a denser space. So like if you look at our, Project Connect is going to do great things, I think, for the city. So I'm wholly behind that. But I think it's understanding who has access to our transit system right now. And it hurts talking about this kind of stuff. It's just thinking that I saw it in Atlanta, where I was coming from before, and I've seen this ecological gentrification, where you beautify a certain piece of infrastructure and then it displaces folks because it raises property value. So you're not even able to build something wonderful for the folks that you were hoping to build it for because of the housing issue you mentioned. I know that some contracts have been created where a certain percentage of units in a multifamily building have to be rent controlled or specific to certain income levels. But I think that those percentages are grossly too low. I think they end up being like 5 to 10%, and then you wonder if they're even sticking to that. And so I don't want this to become something that, and I suspect all of us here, don't want it to be a natural phenomenon, let's say, that happens where, we became more attractive, and therefore people who used to live places can't live there anymore. And I think this is something that's systematic, but I think we need to build the evidence behind it. And I think a lot of it's about who we vote for and what we vote for.
I was just going to make a pitch for some of our amazing faculty in the Community and Regional Planning program. We actually have several nationally renowned affordable housing faculty. And actually, a very influential report, Uprooted, was a partnership with the City of Austin. And this report is highly cited by news media across the country, and it lays out strategies that can be taken to deal with this problem. Massive problem. But thank you for asking. Yeah.
Another big challenge is our zoning code. It's very outdated, and I think people have tried to update it to make it more friendly for dense housing, and it was struck down in the Court of Appeals. So it is a challenge when you have a city where there's just, obviously a huge influx of people. It's a supply and demand issue, right? And then there's not enough housing, can't build it fast enough. There's supply chain issues. So, even just getting them built, if you have them approved, is very difficult. So it's just a very complicated issue. But yeah, as Miriam said, we have a lot of expertise here at UT that I think can speak to a lot of these challenges. So definitely look into all that. Yeah.
I see somebody over there with a question.
Yeah. I'm Philip Duran with the City of Austin Office of Sustainability. I'm the data analyst slash research scientist slash kind of like armchair expert on random topics as they arise. And I engage with Mark and Phoebe and some of these folks up there on these climate equity plan topics. My question is a little bit drier, one kind of process. So it sort of seems like we're in a moment right now where there's a lot of interest in climate and equity and resilience and the collaboration between cities and universities and the community. And these problems, as Phoebe and everybody has described, they're very complicated, probably expensive problems to like research or to correct. But this may be a moment where there's a lot of money for that right now. And I was wondering if the panel has any ideas or recommendations for best practices on how to go out there and get that money and try to fix these problems.
I mean, it's true. There does seem to be a lot of federal funding for this work coming out. And I get an email a week or maybe once every 2 weeks saying, hey, you should apply for this. And it's super long and arduous. I usually send it to Patrick and Dev to figure it out, and hopefully they'll do it. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there is funding out there. It's hard though, because if you don't have a plan in place or an idea or know exactly what you want to do, usually these turnaround dates are within like weeks, sometimes a month, and it takes time to like call somebody, like, what are we going to do? Write 6 pages of text and make sure it makes some sense. Then you apply for it, you don't get it. Then the next one comes in, and you're like, and this is constant sort of chasing, the money. And then also when you get the money, sometimes it's more work than it's worth. Like if there's a lot of strings attached, and sometimes it's like, here, do all this work for $25,000, and it's like, and then we're trying to figure out how to get most of that money to the community and not to us, and that becomes a little bit more of a struggle. So you're right, there is more money, which is wonderful. But I think we don't quite have a system and an engine yet to try to get that into some kind of template and some kind of process to get those things out quicker. And then also when you get it, like, we have to get our stuff together just to use it. I'll give you an example. Is we were able to connect with $3 million to work on resilience hubs at the city of Austin, and which is wonderful, but now we're trying to figure out how do you spend $3 million with the city's purchasing process, which is not easy. Which sounds easy, but it's not. So yes, but. Anybody else want to? I'm just griping.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, well, first of all, Mark sends me this, hey, I think this is really interesting. Do you think we should do it? And it's like, oh, how do you say no to that? But yeah, I think part of your question is, right, thinking about all the, like the infrastructure bill. And so I think taking us out of this research mode, and then how do we start to translate research that we have done into these other kinds of projects, these other buckets of money. And maybe that starts to get like, how do you do that translation and be ready and demonstrate the partnership that has got you to this point in order to get other kinds of money that do deliver projects. And I think that's something, I mean, I don't know if that's where you were getting with your question, but there's something really, and then that's a whole world that I have no idea. How do you get $5 million from the infrastructure bill, right? But there's ways to do it. But I think that's a real, like, something we should really kind of think through is how do you start to link these partnerships that we've developed to do the research, to understand what's needed, to then these other kinds of funding streams.
Yeah, one of the things we've tried to avoid in the VPR's office is, like, sometimes we'll just get, like, even with some of our external partners, like, folks will see a grant opportunity, like, oh, let's go for this. Well, that's fine, but, it's not always strategic. So, like, how do you build the teams, build the capacity, build the networks ahead of those funding opportunities so that you're surrounded around a shared set of principles and values and interests, as opposed to just like, oh, let's just run after this one thing, right? So that's the kind of what we try to do. We're trying to build these networks of researchers, our Bridging Barriers Grand Challenges or other research interest groups, to hopefully get ahead of that in a more strategic way.
So it's about building capacity.
Exactly.
Right. Questions? Oh, so first the guy behind Jess, and then Rohan, and I think that's also one over here.
Hi, I'm Derek Haas, assistant professor in mechanical engineering, and my work is primarily on nuclear engineering. So pretty direct question for Austin Energy. Y'all have wind and solar programs. Would you be interested in a nuclear program as well in part of the renewable/sustainable area of energy production?
So we don't represent Austin Energy.
Okay.
2 is I think 10% of our portfolio is nuclear, right?
Yeah, so Austin Energy, which we do not represent, but has a it has a decarbonization plan, and I believe it's to become carbon free by 2035. I believe within that there is part of the capacity that is nuclear. Part of that plan is no new nuclear, and it's to move towards more renewables. There's a lot of community. Yeah, there was just a lot of community push to make that the case. There's a lot of community push to go 100% renewable. That is a question, right? That's, but yeah, not my area of expertise.
Okay. Sorry for asking the wrong
No,
people.
no, you're
Sorry.
good.
The gentleman in front of you with the white shirt.
Hey everyone, Rohan Lilawala. I'm at the Office of Sustainability. I work with Mark and Phoebe. Glad to see some familiar faces, even though if I haven't met you in person. So I think one of the things that I think is clear about some of the work around the climate equity plan is that there are some areas of research into, I guess, problems that are technical problems that need to be solved. Things like carbon dioxide reduction or sustainable materials or embodied carbon. I think those are technical issues that, there's a clear role for researchers at UT to help answer some of those problems. But then I think there's the other aspect of some of these climate solutions, which are political problems. The technical solutions are pretty clear, and I'm glad that there's questions asked about housing. I think things like housing and transportation, we have the technical solutions, but there are lots of political headwinds to achieving some of those solutions. So what is the role of UT research, city collaboration to developing some of the political solutions and finding ways to overcome some of the political barriers, whether they are at the local level in terms of things like housing, or whether they're at the state level, or the federal level. How can we collaborate to overcome some of those political obstacles?
God, it sounds like it's a question meant for somebody at the School of Public Affairs. I think it's a really great question. Certainly part of what we try to do, or what we do in Austin, is these community surveys. So we're trying to get a sense of the political preferences or of the preferences it's actually quite remarkable, this survey. I have not been running it this long, but it goes back to 2002. And we ask a whole series of questions that sort of have this 20-year time frame. So, for example, how do we ask that question, Jess? Something about the risk of climate change, or how do you anyway. So it's to see sort of these public opinion, these preferences change over time. I think that has political sort of power. Part of what we're trying to do is understand. I don't deal with the political as much as kind of you were framing it, but trying to understand. It goes back to this co-creation. It goes back to governance. How do we make decisions, and can we do that in more equitable ways at the city, at the state? But I think you're exactly right. You spoke it like a real sociologist, which is my training. That we have the technical solutions. It's a problem of politics. It's a problem of policy. It's a problem of social, sort of the social preferences, and those are really big barriers. I know. Listening to this podcast through the course of the pandemic, and a year ago he was talking about the last inch. Like the last inch is the hardest sort of mile, right? We sort of know what needs to be done, but then how do you actually take it that last inch? And I think the same thing goes with so many climate solutions that are sort of shovel ready, but don't have that political will. There's no easy answer.
No, go ahead, Mary.
No, I would just say that maybe a long view helps with that, right? So what's widely acknowledged in applied fields is that the research process can build capacity for particular objectives, and so we're not necessarily contributing in the form of political strategy, but if research has normative value, then there are important questions, there are particular objectives that come of that process. So I would say that the implications of research do in some ways contribute to those problems.
there was a question over here. The mics.
Thank you. So I just had a clarifying question, mainly for Daniel. So is the interlocal agreement, is that primarily for like using city funding to finance or to fund research projects? Is that right?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay.
So, yeah, and I think there, I probably should have stressed this earlier, but there's a misconception. I think that when you see that 1.5 million threshold, that there's like a magic pot of funds of 1.5 million that the city has created, and that's not the case. So, like, all of the funds have to be sourced from the departments. What that does is it sets a ceiling, so you don't have to go to council for authorization as long as it's within that 1.5 million. So very, very important to note, because I think that's people go to our website, they see that number, like, oh, cool, there's like a pot of money that we can go apply for. And it's like, no, actually, it has to come from the departments. And actually, 7 of the 12 contracts that we have on the books right now are from Austin Transportation. So just to give you an idea, like a big, more than half are from Austin Transportation. We have a couple from Austin Water. Yeah. Few scattered throughout the rest of it, but yeah, definitely for city directed projects. Obviously, though, these connections and these the matchmaking that we do can lead to other opportunities, right? So there have been opportunities to go after NSF, like civic innovation grants and other projects.
So to clarify, a city department has money, they identify the scope and what they need, and then they go to you, or they go to department?
So it can kind of work both ways. Sometimes the UTPIs have like a really interesting dynamic idea, and they just want to know if there's somebody at the city who'd be willing to partner with them. So we also are willing to accept those, but we prefer if they come from the city. Again, kind of letting the city lead that agenda. So they'll come up with an idea, they'll submit the form. Charles and I meet on a monthly basis and kind of review them and see, okay, who might we match with this particular staff member? If they meet and they sort of agree on general sort of principles and deliverables, the PI will draft like a work statement or statement of work. The city side and the legal team, Holly Heinrich over there, will work on the work order, and it'll get processed just like any other contract. So yeah, that's kind of the general flow.
So that should encourage all y'all to reach out to departments and try to get them to create some projects and find some money.
Yeah, I like that.
Speaking of, Mark, you just said you had $3 million you were having trouble spending. Should we have some coffee after this?
So I mean, it's a question for you is, we have that money, we can spend it on resilience hubs, and we hope to spend a lot of that on community engagement. We haven't identified research needs. I guess we can't, this is off, no, we're getting recorded.
Yeah, we are being recorded.
Yeah, I guess we can't use the ILA to work with. Yeah, I'm just going to stop talking.
I mean, a few things just to note that it's not for. So it's not for things like capstone projects. It's not for curricula. It's not for capital projects. You're not going to be developing real estate with this. This is strictly for research. So just to be very clear about what it is for. Because I think a lot of times, faculty will come to us and they want to start, they want to support a student project. Like that's not what we're using this for.
Yeah.
We're only using this for research that's led by the city departments.
But community engaged research that includes aspects of engagement.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely supported. Yeah.
Kevin, you raised your hand.
I did. How much layering is possible with this? So it seems like it's between 2 rather large entities that are local, but then I'm wondering how could their partners like a UT Health or like a community partner, is there a way to addend the kind of the interlocal agreement to incorporate others? Like, do you see this expanding? I already know there's many departments and schools within the institution of UT, but I'm wondering if there's more, how do partners play a role?
That's a really interesting question. Actually, it might be a good question for you, Jennifer. I don't know. How do you see that? Yeah. You want to keep it with me? Yeah, I would say.
There's a mic around. Can you pass the mic down?
Yeah, so I'm Jennifer Line-Gardner. I'm the Deputy Vice President for Research here at UT, and Daniel's boss's boss.
Yeah.
So
Say hi.
So the easiest way to do it would not be, so what the lawyers would say is, we don't need to amend the contract. That actually would take a lot more work. It took a lot of work to negotiate the first ILA, to get it around to terms that both UT and the City of Austin's legal teams agree to. The most straightforward way would probably be for another partner to subcontract out, right? So what would happen is there would be an agreed upon work order from the city and a statement of work that the UT faculty member puts together, and in that statement of work would include some plan for partnering with a third entity, could be UT School of Public Health or another organization, and then the funds would flow from the city to UT, and then funds flow from UT over to that other partner through a subcontract. And to your point down at the end earlier about, looking for funding, and this can be a lot of work, and then people have to write proposals and spend time, and then they get rejected. You know who does this all the time and knows a lot about it and is good at it? Faculty at UT. And so it's really good for, it's another thing that's important for the city to think about leveraging is like this expertise in grant seeking and even looking at an opportunity and assessing whether the payoff is worth the effort. This is something that and all the other faculty on the panel know is part of your skill set as faculty, is sort of figuring out, okay, which opportunities are worth my time, and that's something that certainly if you're with the city and you're partnering with UT faculty, they can help in kind of looking through the opportunity and thinking about that together. Like, all right, are we going to want to do this? This is what would be hard, and we have a whole machine behind all of this at UT to actually do the paperwork of the contracts and sending the subawards out and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I spend a lot of my time worried about whether or not this is worth the faculty's time, and how do I mitigate stress and onerous process and that sort of thing. That's like a fair amount of what I worry about. Anytime, when we're trying to bridge those cultures, is just understanding the faculty time is precious. They're pulled in a lot of different directions. Like, how can we make sure this is like a mutually beneficial thing?
I know we have another question, but before we go there, Jonathan, we have 10 minutes, less than 10 minutes left. Should we show the QR code or?
Yeah. So we created. We created a really brief survey with this QR code that is basically, this conversation is hopefully a starting point to greater City of Austin and UT research collaboration, either specifically in the implementation of the climate equity plan or anything broadly related to resilience efforts, or even beyond that perhaps. But that's our starting point, right, is the climate equity plan. And so we just have a brief survey there for people to fill out their interests, their skills, what they would like to see out of that kind of collaboration. And it's a basic Google form. It'll take just a couple minutes to fill out, and I'll be collecting that data over time and sharing it with our panelists and other interested parties.
Great, thank you. And can you pass the mic down to the end? Thank you.
Hello. Okay. Hi, my name is Stevana Strutz, and I just finished working with the IPCC and CNRS in France, and I'm a visiting scholar here at UT with the Jackson School of Geological Sciences. And I'm a disease ecologist, so I'm not familiar with the sociological elements of most of your research. But in regard to what Rohan asked in terms of implementing some of these actual changes and overcoming political will, how much of the research y'all do is disseminated back to the communities in terms of solution and education, and is that an element that's needed in every proposal that the city works with?
Miriam, Patrick, Kevin?
Yes. It is incorporated, I believe, in every proposal at this point. I think community engagement is critical, it's essential. It's I think how projects are seen through an equity lens that's gained traction in the last decade or so. I think they're also being seen through a climate lens now. And I think both of those, as they're intertwined, also relate to community. And so I think you have to have kind of those three pillars within each work. I think in terms of products, when you have, I'm going to speak very NIH-y here, like National Institute of Health, but the idea of study participants and how they are being compensated for their time and energy and resources is, sure, an HEB gift card, local grocer, but then also the products of one's work, right? It's not going to be, we don't want our research to be extractive. We don't want it to simply get us through tenure and promotion. We want this to be something that provides as so willing and as so wanted. And so this isn't us helping, this isn't charity, this is supposed to be something that is working alongside. which is rather difficult to set up. But I do think it's how hyper competitive this extramural funding is these days is you have to have the bells and whistles, but they also have to be a tight plan that isn't just added for the sake of being added. So it has to drive something, and it has to have a further output down the road.
So I would say that there are very important academic goals that we're meeting as faculty, right, in terms of publications. There are things to that we can do in that process. So I've actually had folks from community-based organizations be co-authors in my scholarship. So that meets my scholarly objectives. But I have found that in community-based research, you always do a little bit more than what's outlined when it comes to roles, right? So I have showed up to give presentations to help my community partners in ways outside of the scope of our work. This has included evening meetings, workshops, providing other expertise. I've worked with an organization that's working on becoming anti-racist in its organizational structure. So there's our scope of work, and then there's insight that I have shared with them on that particular topic, right? So there's always a little bit more in addition to the very specific outputs that we have. And that goes back, I've mentioned capacity building. There's capacity building when it comes to the network of environmental policy and change, but there's also organizational capacity building that partners hugely benefit from.
We're going to take one more question, and then maybe Heidi's going to close it out. Yes. Any other questions? So I do want to, is that a question back there? No. I do want to sort of respond to that. It's obvious that a lot of the grant proposals coming out have a specific equity piece to it, or a community engagement piece to it. But also now it's becoming sort of part of our discussion within the city that we do automatically want to do that. The other piece to it too is that we as city staff, we're salaried, so we can't accept funding for our time. And so most of the money that comes in doesn't come to the city. We try to turn it around and go to the community. Now, UT has its own sort of methodology for distributing that funding. But the other piece, and I think the second piece to your question is, we try to connect data to stories and stories to data. And we collect a lot of data, but that data doesn't always make sense, particularly to those communities who are most impacted by it. So we have a lot of discussions like, how do you make that legible and understandable to the community we're working with? And I think that's a struggle, but also a great opportunity.